There are messages you expect to hear someday. And then there are messages you're never meant to receive. This one didn't come with ceremony, no seal, no public statement, no carefully staged photograph, and arrived quietly, almost clinically. Yet, according to multiple people familiar with the moment, it landed like a door being shut in a silent hallway. Loud only because of what it ended. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates 7 minutes ago. That's how this story began circulating. Not as history. Not as a reflection, but as something still unfolding. Still raw. Still being processed in real time by the people closest to it. Because this wasn't just any message. It was described by those who've seen it as final. And when the meaning of it reached Meghan Markle, the reaction wasn't sorrow, it wasn't even shock at first. It was fury. Not the performative kind. Not the kind that leaks instantly to the press. The kind that comes when someone realizes something they assumed was still negotiable no longer is. Begging motors. Let me slow this down because the details matter here. King Charles III is facing the most serious health battle of his life. That much is public. Carefully managed, deliberately sparse in detail, we're told just enough to understand gravity, but not enough to feel intrusive. What isn't public and what changes everything is what happens when time feels shorter than expected. People imagine that moments like these soften positions. That illness automatically brings reconciliation. That old wounds finally close when the clock becomes louder than pride. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes authority hardens. Sometimes boundaries become sharper. Sometimes a person decides that clarity, not comfort, is the final gift they leave behind. This story matters now, not because of legacy, not because of old grievances, but because of timing, because of sequence, because of what was said when it could no longer be walked back, and because of who was not included in that future. What makes this moment unsettling isn't just the message itself, it's the certainty behind it. The absence of ambiguity. The lack of emotional cushioning. People close to the situation have described it using the same phrase, independently, the door is closed, not closing, not temporarily shut. Ba 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 bitch. That phrase alone has set off weeks of quiet panic behind the scenes. Because in royal language, especially when spoken at this level, words aren't chosen casually. They are weighed, tested, sometimes debated for days. And when something this final is delivered privately, it carries a different kind of authority, one that doesn't need public reinforcement. So why are we hearing about it now? Because something went wrong, not in the message itself, but in the assumption about how it would be received. When Meghan Markle learned what had been communicated, the expectation from some quarters was resignation, acceptance, maybe even silence. That's not what happened. What happened instead was described as a sudden emotional reversal. An eruption that caught even her inner circle off guard. One source put it bluntly, she didn't believe it at first. She assumed there had to be more, another layer, a follow-up, a clarification that would arrive later and soften the blow. Because for years, the story, at least privately, had been that nothing was ever truly final. That time would reopen channels. That circumstance would force reconciliation. That assumption died with this message. Ray. And that's why this isn't just another chapter in a long-running family saga. This is a line being drawn at the very end of the page. Here's where we need to be careful. There is a temptation, especially online, to reduce this moment to winners and losers, to loyalty tests. That misses the point. What's unfolding here isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about control of narrative when time is limited. It's about deciding what does and does not continue after you're gone. And according to those familiar with the discussion surrounding this message, it wasn't written in anger. That's the part that unsettles people the most. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm, almost administrative. And calm finality is far more difficult to challenge than emotional rejection. Think about that for a moment. Bro, which would you find easier to fight, a heated argument, or a quietly closed door? The message itself was not meant to be public. It wasn't designed for headlines. It wasn't written with the expectation that anyone outside a very small circle would ever know the wording, but the impact of it, the consequences, were immediate. And once those consequences began to ripple outward, containment became impossible. People talk. Assumptions are tested.
Silences are noticed, especially when certain calls stop being returned.
Especially when intermediaries suddenly go quiet. Especially when the usual soft signals, the subtle acknowledgments, the indirect reassurances disappear all at once. For Meghan Markle, this wasn't just a personal message, it was a strategic shock. Because it didn't simply address the present, it redefined the future. And that's where the anger came from. Not sadness, not grief. Anger born from finality, from the realization that something long believed to be unresolved had been resolved without her. There's an irony here that's hard to ignore. For years, the public narrative has been about distance, about separation, about autonomy. And yet behind the scenes, there was still an assumption, on more than one side, that lines could always be reopened if needed. This message removed that safety net. It said, in effect, this story ends here. No follow-up chapter, no postscript, no quiet reconciliation later when emotions have cooled. Just an ending. And endings are hard to accept when you didn't get to help write them. Now, to be clear, no one is claiming this message was cruel, or vindictive, or even unkind in tone. What it was, according to those who've seen it, was definitive. That's a different kind of power. And power, when exercised at the end of a reign, carries a weight that's difficult to counter. Especially when illness changes the rules of engagement. There's another detail that's important here, and it's one most people overlook. This message didn't arrive at the worst moment of the illness. It arrived at a moment of relative clarity. That matters, because it suggests intention, not decline. Decision, not confusion. Awareness, not weakness. Which removes a key argument that might otherwise have been used to challenge it later. You can't say it was misunderstood. You can't say it was confused. You can't say it wasn't meant. And that's precisely why the reaction was so intense. Because once that door closed, there was no obvious mechanism to reopen it. No appeal process, no intermediary with leverage, no future meeting scheduled when things calmed down. It was simply over. At least, that's how it was understood by those closest to the moment. And that understanding sent shockwaves through relationships that had been built on ambiguity. Here's a question worth sitting with. If someone tells you clearly and calmly that a door is closed, do you accept it, or do you immediately start looking for another entrance? That question sits at the heart of what happened next. Because according to people familiar with Meghan Markle's response, acceptance was not immediate. Not even close. The first reaction was disbelief. A sense that something had been miscommunicated. That nuance had been lost in translation. The second reaction was urgency. Calls, messages, attempts to clarify. And when those attempts met silence, urgency turned into something sharper, something more volatile. We'll get to that, but before we do, it's important to understand the emotional contradiction that makes this moment so powerful. On the surface, this looks like closure. Underneath, it's unresolved. Because closure imposed from one side doesn't always feel like closure to the other. It can feel like erasure. Prison? And that perception, whether accurate or not, is what fuels conflict long after words are spoken. This is why the timing matters so much. Had this message arrived years earlier, it might have been framed as negotiation, as a hard line that could still be tested. Had it arrived much later, it might never have been delivered at all. Instead, it arrived at a moment when authority still existed, but time was undeniably finite. That combination is rare and dangerous because it produces decisions that aren't softened by the promise of tomorrow. They are designed for permanence. So when people ask why this story matters now, the answer is simple. Because it's still moving. Because reactions are still unfolding. Because the consequences are not yet fully visible. And because one person's attempt at final clarity has triggered another person's refusal to accept it. That tension between finality and resistance, is where everything starts to unravel. In the next part, we're going to look closely at how this message was delivered, who knew before others, and why its phrasing mattered more than anyone initially realized. There's a misconception about messages like this. People imagine a dramatic delivery, a sealed envelope, a formal handover with witnesses standing by, aware they're present at something historic. That isn't how this happened. In fact, the way this message moved, quietly, almost invisibly, is part of what made it so powerful, and part of what made the reaction on the other side so explosive. Because this message wasn't delivered to the world, it wasn't even delivered to its intended recipient directly. It moved sideways, through people who weren't supposed to be the story. That detail alone should give you pause. Here's the uncomfortable truth about moments like these. The most consequential decisions are often communicated in the least dramatic ways. No cameras, no speeches. Just a few words passed between individuals who understand exactly what they mean and exactly what they end. According to multiple sources familiar with the chain of events, the message originated during a tightly controlled internal discussion, not a family gathering. Not a reconciliation attempt, an administrative conversation. That's important, because it frames the intent. This wasn't emotional outreach, it wasn't even a response to pressure. It was a decision being documented, and once documented, it became real. The message was not addressed by name. That detail has been confirmed repeatedly. It spoke in terms of boundaries, not people, of future parameters, not past grievances. That kind of language is deliberate. When you avoid names, you avoid debate. You make the statement about policy, not personality. And that's exactly what made it so difficult to challenge later. The people present understood immediately what it meant. There was no confusion in the room. No request for clarification. No raised voices. Just an acknowledgement. One source described the moment as uncomfortably calm. Another used the phrase decisive quiet. That's not the sound of chaos. That's the sound of a door being closed carefully, so it doesn't slam. Now here's where things start to get complicated. Because while the message itself was never meant to travel beyond a very small circle, the implications of it made that containment unrealistic. Decisions like this don't exist in a vacuum. They ripple outward. They change how people behave, who they respond to, who they stop responding to. Silence becomes structured. And structured silence is noticed, especially by people who are used to indirect access. Within hours, not days, there were subtle shifts. Messages unanswered. Intermediaries suddenly unavailable. A cooling that wasn't announced, but felt. But for someone watching closely, it would have been unmistakable. That's how the message began to leak, not through words, but through absence. And absence is often louder than explanation. At first, the assumption on the other side was logistical. Scheduling issues, health constraints, the kind of disruption that comes with a serious medical situation, reasonable explanations. But then, patterns emerged. The same silence. The same deflection, the same closed loop. And when those patterns repeat, doubt turns into suspicion. This is where the story stops being about a message and starts being about interpretation, because people don't react to what's said. They react to what it means for their future, and the future implied here was stark. No more indirect pathways, no more tentative overtures, no more later. The word later disappeared, and when later disappears, urgency rushes in to fill the space. Now here's a detail that hasn't been discussed publicly, and it's critical. This message did not emerge from conflict. There was no triggering argument, no final blow-up, no dramatic exchange that forced a line to be drawn. It emerged from evaluation. That's far more unsettling, because evaluation suggests review. Consideration, a weighing of options that ends not with compromise, but with conclusion, which raises a difficult question. If this wasn't reactive, what is this? How long had it been coming? People close to the process insist this wasn't impulsive. That it followed weeks of discussion, reflection, and consultation. Not about emotion, about structure. About what would, and would not, continue to exist once authority transitioned. And here's where illness subtly changes everything. When time feels expansive, decisions can be deferred. When time feels limited, deferral becomes its own risk. That's the mindset that shaped this message. It wasn't about settling scores. It was about defining boundaries that would outlast the person defining them. And that kind of decision doesn't ask for permission. Which brings us to the way the message finally reached Meghan Markle. It didn't arrive as a document. It didn't arrive as a call. It arrived as information. Filtered. Summarized. Relayed. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when you don't receive the original wording, your mind fills in the gaps. You imagine tone. You infer intent. And what was inferred here was worse than what was actually written. According to one person familiar with the exchange, the first time Meghan heard about the message, it sounded provisional, conditional, but like a hard line that might still bend. That misunderstanding shaped the initial reaction. Disbelief, yes, but not panic. That came later. But because as more details emerged, not through clarification, but through confirmation, the reality set in. This wasn't a negotiating position. It wasn't leverage. It was an endpoint. And endpoints provoke a very specific kind of response. People don't argue with them at first. They test them. They look for cracks or inconsistencies for someone who might interpret the words differently.